Right now, as you're listening to this, there's probably some money sitting in your pocket or your wallet or maybe just existing as numbers on your phone screen. And you've probably never stopped to think about how absolutely bizarre that is. I mean, really think about it. We've all agreed that these pieces of paper or these metal discs or these digital numbers have value. We'll trade hours of our lives, our labor, our skills for them. We'll even fight over them. But why? What makes money money? Tonight we're going to take a journey through time. A long, winding journey that starts tens of thousands of years ago and brings us right up to today. We're going to explore how humans went from trading shells and feathers to buying coffee with a tap of their phone. And I promise you, this story is far stranger and more fascinating than you might think. So get comfortable, settle in. Let your mind wander through the centuries with me as we uncover the history of money. Before money existed, life was complicated. Imagine you're living 10,000 years ago. You're a really good fisherman. You've spent all day catching fish, and now you've got more than you can eat. But you don't have a good axe. And your neighbor, well, they make excellent axes. So you walk over with your fish and you say, "Hey, want to trade?" Sounds simple enough, right? Except what if your neighbor doesn't want fish? What if they're vegetarian, or they just caught a bunch of fish yesterday, or they're allergic to seafood? You're standing there with your fish, which are getting less fresh by the minute, and you can't get what you need. This is the problem economists call the double coincidence of wants. Both people have to want what the other person has at the exact same time. And that doesn't happen nearly as often as you'd think. So communities developed something called barter systems, but these were more sophisticated than we usually imagine. People didn't just randomly trade things. They developed complex social networks and informal credit systems. You'd give your neighbor fish today, and they'd remember that. They'd owe you. And maybe 3 months from now, when they had an extra axe, they'd give it to you. These weren't just economic transactions, they were social bonds. Every trade was a relationship. But here's the thing about these systems. They only work in small communities where everyone knows everyone. You can't run a civilization on IOUs and social obligations. As human societies grew larger and more complex, as people started trading with strangers from distant places, we needed something else. We needed a medium of exchange that everyone would accept, something that would hold its value over time, something portable and divisible. We needed money. Now, what makes something money? This is actually a fascinating question. For something to function as money, it generally needs to fulfill 3 roles. First, it has to be a medium of exchange, meaning people will accept it in trade. Second, it needs to be a store of value, so you can save it for later and it won't lose its worth. And third, it has to be a unit of account, a way to measure and compare the value of different things. Early humans got creative with this, really creative. All over the world, different societies independently invented different forms of money, and some of them were absolutely wild. We're not just talking about gold and silver here. We're talking about shells, feathers, stones the size of cars, squirrel pelts, cocoa beans, salt, tea bricks, and in at least one case, live cows. Each of these early forms of money tells us something about the people who used them, what they valued, what was rare in their environment, what they could make or find that others couldn't. Money has always been a reflection of human culture, not just economics. It's a mirror that shows us what we care about. And here's something that might surprise you. For most of human history, money wasn't made by governments, it wasn't official. There was no central bank deciding what could and couldn't be money. Money was something that emerged organically from communities, from trade networks, from people solving the practical problem of how to exchange value. The idea that some authority should control money, that's actually a relatively recent invention in the grand scope of human history. So let's begin at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as we can get. Let's talk about the very first things humans used as money, long before anyone had ever minted a coin or printed a bill. The earliest forms of money weren't trying to be money. That's the interesting part. They started as things people actually wanted, things that had intrinsic value. Archaeologists call this commodity money, and it dominated human economic life for thousands upon thousands of years. One of the earliest forms of money we know about was cowrie shells. These small, glossy shells from sea snails were used as currency across Africa, Asia, and even parts of Europe for literally thousands of years. The last place to officially use them as money was Uganda, which didn't retire them until the 1960s. Think about that. These shells were money for longer than any currency that exists today has been around. But why shells? Well, they had some pretty practical advantages. They were durable, fairly uniform in size, hard to counterfeit because of their distinctive shape and texture, and they were rare in many inland areas, which gave them value. You couldn't just pick them up off any beach. They had to be collected from specific species in specific places, usually the Maldives in the Indian Ocean, and then transported along trade routes. This natural scarcity made them perfect as currency. In North America, indigenous peoples developed wampum, intricate beads made from clamshells woven into belts and strings. But here's where we often get the story wrong. Wampum wasn't primarily used as money before Europeans arrived. It was more important as a ceremonial object, a way to record treaties and important events, a symbol of status. It only became money when Dutch and English colonists, who didn't have enough of their own currency in the New World, started using it to trade with indigenous peoples. The Europeans actually created an inflation problem by mass-producing wampum, which devalued it and disrupted indigenous economies. Even early monetary systems weren't immune to economic crises. In China, they used cowrie shells too, but they also used something else: spades and knives. Not like actual working spades and knives. These were miniature bronze replicas cast in the shape of tools and weapons. You can see the logic there. Tools and weapons had obvious value. Everyone needed them. So it made sense to use them as a medium of exchange. Over time, these token spades and knives became more and more abstract, smaller and simpler, until eventually they evolved into flat bronze discs. These were some of the world's first true coins, appearing in China around 1000 BCE. On the other side of the world, the Aztecs used cocoa beans as money. Yes, chocolate. If you had a pocket full of cocoa beans, you were literally carrying chocolate money. The beans were valuable because chocolate was highly prized as a drink, especially by the nobility. There were even counterfeiters who would hollow out cocoa beans and refill them with dirt. The Aztecs also used standardized pieces of cloth and quills filled with gold dust. Their economy was remarkably sophisticated, with markets in every town and a professional merchant class. But probably the most unusual form of early money comes from the island of Yap in Micronesia. They used massive stone discs called rye stones, some of which were 12 feet in diameter and weighed thousands of pounds. These stones were carved from limestone on an island hundreds of miles away, then transported by canoe, which was incredibly dangerous. Many people died in the process, which actually made those particular stones more valuable. Here's the wild part. Because these stones were so big and heavy, they didn't actually move them when they changed ownership. The stone would just sit there, maybe in front of someone's house, and everyone in the village would know who it belonged to. Ownership was tracked through oral history. There's even a story about one rye stone that fell into the ocean during transport. It sank to the bottom, never to be recovered. But everyone agreed it still existed, and it continued to change hands in transactions for generations, even though no one had seen it for years. It was currency that no one could physically access. Sound familiar? It's not that different from modern digital currency when you think about it. The ancient Egyptians had a complex system based on standardized weights of copper, silver, and gold. They used rings and bars that represented these weights, and prices for goods were calculated in terms of them. But here's the thing, they didn't always physically exchange the metal. Often they would calculate a trade in terms of these weights without actually using them, similar to how we might say, Something costs a certain amount of money without pulling out specific bills. All of these early forms of money tell us something important. Money isn't about the object itself. It never has been. Money is about agreement, about trust, about a shared belief that something has value.
Around
because we all say it
600
does. BCE, something revolutionary happened in the ancient kingdom of Lydia, in what's now Turkey. Someone, and we don't know exactly who, had an idea that would change the world forever. They took pieces of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, and they stamped them with an official seal. They created the first coins. Now, this might not sound like a big deal. People had been using precious metals as money for a while already. But the invention of coinage was actually a massive leap forward. Before coins, every transaction involving precious metal required weighing and assessing purity. Was this gold really gold? Was it mixed with other metals? How much did it weigh exactly? Every trade needed a scale and someone who knew what they were doing. Coins solved this problem. By stamping a coin with an official seal, the issuing authority was essentially saying, "This coin contains this much of this metal at this purity. You don't need to test it or weigh it, you can trust us." It was a guarantee. And it made trade so much faster and more efficient. The Lydian innovation spread like wildfire. Within a century, city-states throughout Greece were minting their own coins. Each city had its own designs, usually featuring their patron deity or a local symbol. Athens had its owl, Corinth had its Pegasus, Aegina had its turtle. These weren't just economic tools, they were statements of civic pride, miniature works of art that traveled far beyond the cities that made them. The Greeks got really into coinage. They developed sophisticated minting techniques and created coins of extraordinary beauty. Some of the coins from Greek Sicily are considered among the finest examples of ancient art. But they also understood that coins were about more than aesthetics. They were about trust and authority. Here's where it gets interesting. When Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world in the 4th century BCE, he did something clever. He standardized currency across his massive empire. Alexander's coins featured his face, or sometimes the face of Hercules, who he claimed as an ancestor, and they were accepted everywhere from Greece to Egypt to India. For the first time in history, there was something approaching an international currency. A merchant could travel thousands of miles and use the same money everywhere. But Alexander's empire fell apart after his death, and eventually another power rose that would take coinage to its logical conclusion: Rome. The Romans were organizational geniuses, and they applied that genius to money. They developed a sophisticated monetary system with different denominations for different transactions. The aureus was gold, the denarius was silver, the sestertius and dupondius were brass, and the as was copper. They had a whole hierarchy of coins, each worth a specific fraction of the others. More importantly, the Romans understood that controlling currency was about controlling power. Roman coins spread wherever Roman legions marched. They carried the emperor's face into the furthest reaches of the empire. Every time someone used a Roman coin, they were participating in Roman power, acknowledging Roman authority. Money was propaganda. The Romans also figured out something that governments have been doing ever since, something that would have profound implications. They figured out that they could debase their currency. Here's how it worked. Say, you're the emperor, and you need to pay your legions, but you don't have enough silver. So you take your silver coins, and you melt them down, and you mix in some cheaper metal. Then you mint new coins that look the same but contain less actual silver. You've just created more coins out of the same amount of silver. In the short term, this works great. You can pay your soldiers, fund your building projects, keep the empire running. But eventually people figure out that the coins aren't worth what they used to be. Prices go up. The currency loses value. It's inflation, and the Romans experienced several severe bouts of it, especially during the crisis of the 3rd century, when the silver content of Roman coins fell to less than 5%. This is one of the first recorded examples of a government manipulating the money supply and the economic consequences that follow. It's a lesson that would be relearned over and over throughout history, usually the hard way. The Roman monetary system was so successful that it lasted for centuries and influenced European coinage for more than 1,000 years after Rome fell. The British pound, the Italian lira, even the humble word money itself, all trace their origins back to Roman currency terms. When Rome fell in the West in 476 CE, many things were lost, but the idea of standardized coinage survived. In the East, the Byzantine Empire continued the Roman tradition, issuing the solidus, a gold coin so reliable and stable that it remained the standard currency of the Mediterranean for 700 years. The word soldier comes from solidus because that's what you paid
After
them with. Rome fell, Europe entered a period we often call the Dark Ages, though historians don't really like that term anymore. But economically, things did get darker. Long-distance trade collapsed, cities shrank, people retreated to rural manners and tried to survive, and coinage, well, it didn't disappear exactly, but it became a lot less common. For several centuries in medieval Europe, many people went back to a barter economy, or they used what we might call a gift economy, where social obligations mattered more than monetary transactions. If you were a peasant on a manor, you didn't get paid in coins for your work. You got land to farm, protection from your lord, and you owed him a portion of your harvest and a certain number of days of labor. Money barely entered into it. But coins never completely vanished. The Catholic Church still collected tithes in money. Kings still paid their armies in coins when they could. Merchants in the surviving cities still traded with currency. And gradually, century by century, the money economy came back. One of the most interesting developments in medieval Europe was something called coin clipping. See, early medieval coins weren't perfectly round. They were basically irregular lumps of silver or gold hammered into rough coin shapes. So people realized they could shave off a little bit of metal from the edges of coins and keep the shavings. They'd clip dozens or hundreds of coins, accumulate enough gold or silver to melt down and sell, and then pass the clipped coins off at full value. This became such a problem that it was made a crime punishable by death in many places. Governments tried all sorts of solutions. They created coins with milled edges, those little grooves around the rim that still exist on many coins today. The grooves made it obvious if someone had filed down the edge. It's amazing how a feature that started as anti-counterfeiting technology has persisted even though modern coins ain't made of precious metals. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, which stretched from Spain to India during the medieval period, commerce was thriving. Muslim merchants dominated trade across the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the overland Silk Road routes. They dealt in gold dinars and silver dirhams, coins of remarkably consistent weight and purity. The dinar was so trusted that European Christians often preferred it to their own coins when trading. Islamic scholars also made important theoretical contributions to economics. They wrote about fair pricing, the ethics of profit, the problems of inflation, and the role of currency in society. These ideas would later influence European economic thinking when Islamic texts were translated into Latin during the Renaissance. In China, something even more revolutionary was happening. During the Tang dynasty, around the 9th century, Chinese merchants started using something called flying money. These were promissory notes, basically early paper money. A merchant in one city could deposit coins with a banking house and receive a note. They could then travel to another city and exchange the note for coins there. It saved them from having to physically transport heavy metals across dangerous roads. Under the Song dynasty, the Chinese government took this further and issued the first official paper money in world history. They called it jiaozi, and at first it was backed by precious metals. You could theoretically exchange your paper note for coins, but eventually the government started printing more notes than they had metal to back them. It's that Roman trick again, just with paper instead of debased coins. and it led to the same result: inflation. When the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, they were fascinated by paper money. Kublai Khan issued his own paper currency and made it the only legal tender in China. If you traded in gold or silver instead of the official paper money, you could be executed. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who visited China in the 13th century, was amazed by this system. He couldn't believe that people would accept paper as money. Back in Europe, the idea seemed insane. The Mongol paper money eventually collapsed due to overprinting and inflation, and China went back to metallic currency for several centuries. But the concept had been proven. Paper money was possible, and it was enormously convenient compared to carrying around bags of coins. Back in medieval Europe, another financial innovation was developing that would prove just as important as paper money, maybe more so. Italian merchants, especially in cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence, were inventing modern banking. They accepted deposits, made loans, transferred funds between cities through a network of branch offices. They even invented double-entry bookkeeping, the accounting method that's still used today. These Italian bankers, the Medici family being the most famous, became incredibly wealthy and powerful. They financed kings, popes, and wars. They proved that you could make money from money itself through lending and interest without ever producing any actual goods. The year 1492 changed everything, not just because Columbus stumbled into the Americas while trying to reach Asia, though that was certainly significant, but because the European discovery of the Americas unleashed a flood of precious metals into the world economy on a scale never seen before. The Spanish conquistadors found gold and silver in quantities they could barely imagine. They found the Aztec and Incan treasures, rooms filled with golden artwork, and then they found something even better: mines. The silver mines of Potosi in what's now Bolivia became legendary. At its peak, Potosi might have been the richest city in the world, and it was sitting at 13,000 feet in the Andes mountain. The Spanish forced indigenous people and later imported African slaves to work these mines under brutal conditions. Millions died, but the silver flowed, tons and tons of it shipped across the Pacific to the Philippines and then to China, or across the Atlantic to Spain. So much silver entered the world economy that it caused what historians call the price revolution. Prices across Europe roughly tripled during the 16th century because there was suddenly so much more money chasing the same amount of goods. Spain itself suffered terribly from inflation, despite being the source of all this wealth. There's an irony there that wasn't lost on observers at the time. Spanish silver enriched other European nations, particularly England and the Netherlands, more than it did Spain itself. This massive influx of precious metals had another effect too. It monetized the world economy in a way that had never happened before. There was enough silver and gold circulating that even ordinary people could use coins regularly. Money penetrated deeper into daily life. The Spanish dollar, also called the piece of 8 because it could be cut into 8 pieces, became the world's first truly global currency. It was used in Europe, in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia. Chinese merchants demanded payment in Spanish dollars. The currency was so successful that when the United States created its own dollar in 1792, they based it on the Spanish dollar. Even today, the dollar sign might derive from the Spanish coat of arms that appeared on those old coins. But the age of exploration brought another form of money into horrifying prominence: human beings. The Atlantic slave trade turned people into commodities, into money. Enslaved Africans were bought and sold, their value calculated in pounds, sterling, or Spanish dollars. Ships transported them across the ocean in the infamous Middle Passage, then sold them in American markets. The economic calculations were cold and brutal. So much for a healthy young man, less for a woman, less still for a child. This wasn't money in the sense we've been discussing, but it was part of the same economic system, the same web of exchange and value. The sugar, tobacco, and cotton that enslaved people were forced to produce generated enormous wealth that flowed back to Europe and helped finance the Industrial Revolution. The history of money is inseparable from this history of exploitation and suffering. Meanwhile, the increasing complexity of global trade created a need for more sophisticated financial instruments. Bills of exchange, which had existed in simple forms for centuries, became standardized and widely used. These were basically early checks, or IOUs. A merchant in London could write a bill promising to pay a certain amount in 3 months, and a merchant in Amsterdam could accept it and later redeem it for cash. This system required trust and creditworthiness. Reputations mattered enormously. If you failed to honor your bills, word would spread through the merchant community, and you'd be ruined. In a way, credit was becoming as important as cash. The Dutch, who had fought their way to independence from Spain and become a major trading power, established the Amsterdam Wisselbank in 1609. This was one of the first true central banks, though it didn't function exactly like modern central banks. It accepted deposits of coins, examined them for weight and purity, and then credited accounts with standardized bank money. This bank money was more reliable than the bewildering variety of coins circulating in Amsterdam from dozens of different countries. The Wisselbank did something else interesting too. It held more deposits than it had physical coins in its vault. Not drastically more, but still. It was an early form of fractional reserve banking, the system that dominates modern banking. The bank was betting that not everyone would want their money at the same time, so it could safely keep less than 100% reserves. This worked fine until people panicked, and everyone did try to withdraw their money at once. Then it was a disaster. This pattern, the boom and bust, the cycle of confidence and panic, would repeat throughout financial history. By the end of the 17th century, the foundations of modern finance were in place. Banks, stock markets, government bonds, joint stock companies, insurance, complex credit instruments. Money was becoming increasingly abstract, increasingly divorced from physical objects. The English goldsmith bankers of the 17th century stumbled into creating paper money almost by accident. People would bring them gold and silver for safekeeping because goldsmiths had secure vaults. In return, the goldsmith would issue a receipt promising to return the precious metals on demand. People soon realized something convenient. Instead of going back to the goldsmith, withdrawing their gold and then giving that gold to someone else who would just deposit it with a goldsmith again, why not just trade the receipts? The paper receipt started circulating as money, backed by the gold in the vault. The goldsmiths noticed something else too. Most of the gold in their vaults just sat there. People were happy trading the paper receipts, so the goldsmiths started lending out some of the gold that had been deposited with them, charging interest on the loans. They'd issue more receipts than they had gold to back them. This is fractional reserve banking, and it's risky, but it's also enormously profitable when it works. Sometimes it didn't work. Sometimes too many people would demand their gold at once, and a goldsmith banker would fail spectacularly. But the system persisted because it was just too useful. In 1694, the British government was in trouble. King William needed money to fight a war against France, but Parliament didn't want to give him too much power by just granting him funds. So they came up with an ingenious solution. They would create a private bank, the Bank of England, and this bank would lend money to the government. In return, the bank would get special privileges, including the right to issue paper banknotes. The Bank of England wasn't a central bank in the modern sense, not yet, but it was a beginning. Its notes became increasingly important in the British economy, and because Britain was becoming the world's dominant economic and military power, the Bank of England's policies would eventually influence the entire world. But Britain wasn't the first European country to experiment seriously with paper money. That dubious honor goes to France, and it's a story of spectacular failure. In 1716, a Scottish economist named John Law convinced the French government to let him establish a bank that would issue paper money. Law was brilliant and charismatic, and he had a radical idea. He believed that increasing the money supply would stimulate the economy. More money meant more trade, more investment, more prosperity. At first, it seemed to work. Law's bank issued notes. The economy boomed. Then Law took control of the Mississippi Company, which supposedly had exclusive trading rights to France's Louisiana Territory in America. He began a massive propaganda campaign about the incredible wealth to be found there. The company's stock price soared. People went crazy for Mississippi Company stock. They mortgaged their houses, sold their possessions, everything to buy shares. The word millionaire was actually invented during this period to describe the nouveau riche who'd gotten wealthy from the Mississippi scheme. But it was all built on nothing. Louisiana wasn't full of gold. It was a sparsely populated wilderness. When people started figuring this out, panic set in. Everyone tried to sell their shares at once. Everyone tried to redeem their paper notes for coins at once. The bank couldn't possibly pay everyone. The system collapsed. This was history's first modern financial bubble and crash, and it was catastrophic. People lost everything. The French economy was devastated, and France wouldn't seriously experiment with paper money again for decades. The failure poisoned the idea of paper currency in the French mind. But in Britain and its colonies, paper money gradually gained acceptance. By the mid-18th century, many American colonies were issuing their own paper currency to make up for a chronic shortage of coins. Benjamin Franklin actually printed some of these colonial notes, and he became a vocal defender of paper money. The colonial paper currencies worked reasonably well when governments were careful not to issue too much. But when the American Revolutionary War started, the Continental Congress needed to pay for the war somehow. They started printing continental dollars, a lot of them, without any real backing. The phrase, "not worth a continental," entered the American vocabulary because the notes became worthless due to hyperinflation. By 1781, continental currency had lost 99% of its value. It was another lesson in the dangers of printing too much money, a lesson that apparently needs to be relearned every generation or so. Despite these failures, paper money was here to stay. It was simply too convenient compared to carrying around heavy coins. The trick was figuring out how to manage it properly, how to maintain its value while still issuing enough to meet the economy's needs. This balancing act would preoccupy economists and policymakers for the next 2 centuries. By the early 19th century, a consensus was forming among economists and government officials. Paper money was useful, probably necessary, but it needed to be backed by something solid. It needed to be convertible into precious metal on demand, or people wouldn't trust it. And increasingly that precious metal was gold. Silver had some problems as a monetary standard. There was a lot of it. New mines kept being discovered, and its value fluctuated quite a bit. Gold was rarer, more stable, and it had that psychological appeal. Humanity has always been weirdly obsessed with gold. So gradually, major economies moved to a gold standard. Britain went on the gold standard officially in 1821, though they'd been moving that direction for a while. The British pound was defined as a specific weight of gold, and the Bank of England promised to exchange paper notes for gold at that fixed rate. Other countries followed: Germany, the United States, France, eventually most of the developed world. By the late 19th century, there was a global gold standard. Currencies had fixed exchange rates with each other because they were all defined in terms of gold. A British pound was worth this much gold, an American dollar was worth that much gold, so you could easily calculate how many dollars equaled a pound. This system had some real advantages. It provided stability and predictability in international trade. It prevented governments from printing too much money because they could only issue as many notes as they had gold to back them. It was disciplined, but it also had serious drawbacks. The money supply was limited by how much gold existed, which meant economies couldn't grow as fast as they might otherwise. And when economic crises hit, governments couldn't respond flexibly because they were locked into maintaining the gold standard. The gold standard also created some odd political conflicts. In the United States, farmers and debtors wanted the money supply expanded by allowing silver to back currency alongside gold. They felt, not incorrectly, that the gold standard kept money scarce and interest rates high, which benefited wealthy creditors at their expense. This conflict dominated American politics in the 1890s. William Jennings Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech in 1896 was all about this. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," he thundered. Bryan lost the election, and the US stayed on the gold standard, but the debate revealed real tensions in the system. The gold standard era coincided with rapid industrialization and globalization. Steamships and railroads connected the world like never before. Telegraph cables spanned oceans, allowing instant communication between continents. Capital flowed freely across borders. In many ways, the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a level of economic integration that would not be matched again until the late 20th century. But this golden age, pun intended, was built on some shaky foundations. The system depended on all the major economies playing by the same rules, maintaining their gold reserves, not printing too much currency. It required cooperation and restraint. Then came World War I and the whole system collapsed. Wars are expensive, incredibly expensive. The Great War cost more money than anyone had imagined possible. Governments needed to spend far more than they had in gold reserves. So one by one, they suspended the gold standard. They started printing money to pay for the war, backed by nothing but the government's promise that it had value. Some countries experienced terrible inflation as a result. Germany, forced to pay massive reparations after the war and printing money to do so, suffered hyperinflation so severe that prices would double in a matter of days. People carried money in wheelbarrows. Life savings became worthless. A postage stamp cost billions of marks. It was economic chaos, and it helped set the stage for political extremism and eventually World War II. After World War I, there were attempts to restore the gold standard, but they never really worked. Britain went back on gold in 1925, but at the wrong exchange rate, which made British exports uncompetitively expensive. This contributed to high unemployment and economic stagnation. Then came the Great Depression, and the gold standard made it worse. When economies crashed, governments needed to spend money to stimulate recovery, but the gold standard prevented them from doing so. Countries that abandoned gold earlier generally recovered faster. The United States went off the gold standard domestically in 1933 as part of FDR's New Deal. It became illegal for Americans to own gold. The government confiscated private gold holdings, paying $20.67 per ounce, then immediately revalued gold to $35 per ounce. It was a massive devaluation of the dollar, designed to make exports cheaper and imports more expensive, and to give the government more flexibility to fight the depression. By the late 1930s, the classical gold standard was effectively dead, though few people realized it yet. World War II accelerated changes that had been building for decades. Total war required total economic mobilization. Governments controlled wages, prices, production. Money became even more abstract, even more a tool of state policy. When the war ended, the victorious Allies, particularly the United States and Britain, faced a question. What would the post-war monetary system look like? They couldn't just go back to the old gold standard. That system had failed, but they needed something to provide stability and facilitate international trade. In July 1944, delegates from 44 countries gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Over 3 weeks of intense negotiations, they hammered out a new international monetary system. The Bretton Woods Agreement was one of the most important economic arrangements in history. Here's how it worked. The US dollar would be backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The US government promised that foreign governments could exchange their dollars for gold at that rate. Then all other currencies would have fixed exchange rates with the dollar. The pound, the franc, the mark, all of them pegged to the dollar, which was pegged to gold. In effect, the dollar became the world's reserve currency. International trade was conducted in dollars. Countries held dollars in reserve, dollars. It was a position of enormous privilege for the United States, and it reflected the reality that America had emerged from World War II as the world's dominant economic power. The Bretton Woods system also created two new international institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF would help countries with balance of payments problems, and the World Bank would finance development projects. These institutions still exist today, though they've changed significantly. For about 25 years, the Bretton Woods system worked remarkably well. The post-war period saw unprecedented economic growth and prosperity in developed countries. International trade expanded dramatically. Europe and Japan rebuilt from the devastation of war. It was the golden age of capitalism. But there were problems brewing. The system depended on the US maintaining enough gold reserves to back all those dollars circulating around the world. As the American economy grew and American companies invested abroad, more and more dollars were flowing overseas. The ratio of dollars to gold was getting worse. By the 1960s, it became clear that there wasn't enough gold at Fort Knox to redeem all the dollars that existed. Countries began to get nervous. France, under Charles de Gaulle, started demanding gold for its dollars, essentially calling America's bluff. The Vietnam War made things worse. The US was printing money to fund the war, adding to inflation and further undermining confidence in the dollar. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon gave a televised address. He announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at a fixed rate. The window was closed. It was supposed to be temporary, but it turned out to be permanent. The Bretton Woods system was dead. This was one of the most significant economic events of the 20th century, but a lot of people didn't understand what had happened. Suddenly, the dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore. It wasn't backed by anything except the promise of the US government that it had value. The dollar had become what's called fiat currency. Fiat is Latin for "let it be done." The government simply decreed that the dollar was money, and that was that. Every major currency followed suit. By the mid-1970s, the entire world was on fiat currency. For the first time in history, money was completely divorced from precious metals. Some people predicted catastrophe. Gold bugs warned that fiat currency would inevitably lead to runaway inflation and economic collapse. They've been warning about this for 50 years now, and while there have been problems, the catastrophe hasn't materialized. Instead, the end of Bretton Woods ushered in a new era. Exchange rates began to float freely, determined by market forces rather than government decree. This made the global economy more flexible but also more volatile. Currency crises became more common. Central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve in the US, gained enormous power. Without the constraint of gold convertibility, they could manipulate the money supply more freely. They could respond to economic crises by printing money, lowering interest rates, buying government bonds. The art and science of monetary policy became crucial. The 1970s were economically turbulent. There was high inflation, economic stagnation, oil shocks, a crisis of confidence. Some wondered if capitalism itself was failing, but economists and policymakers learned from the crisis. By the 1980s, central banks had figured out how to manage fiat currency reasonably well, mostly by targeting inflation and maintaining credibility. The post-Bretton Woods era saw the rise of new financial instruments and markets, derivatives, futures, options, all kinds of complex securities. The financial sector grew enormously as a share of the economy. By the 21st century, the amount of money sloshing around in global financial markets dwarfed the actual economists and central bankers were figuring out fiat currency. Another revolution was happening quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Money was going digital. The process started in the 1950s and 60s with the first credit cards. Diners Club launched the first general-purpose charge card in 1950. American Express followed in 1958. Bank of America created the Bank Americard in 1958, which would eventually become Visa. Credit cards were revolutionary, though it took a while for people to understand how revolutionary. They separated the act of purchasing from the act of payment. You could buy something today and pay for it later. You were essentially getting a small, short-term loan with every purchase. More importantly, credit cards meant that money was becoming information. When you swiped your card, no physical currency changed hands. Instead, information was transmitted. The merchant's bank would credit their account, your bank would debit yours. Money had become entries in ledgers, electronic pulses moving through wires. The infrastructure to support this took decades to build. Banks needed to create networks that could authorize transactions in real time. They needed computers to track accounts and process payments. They needed secure telecommunications. The first ATM was installed in London in 1967. It was a clunky machine that used radioactive checks to authenticate users. Not exactly user-friendly, but the technology improved rapidly. By the 1980s, ATMs were everywhere, and people could access their money 24/7 without going to a bank branch. Then came the internet, and everything accelerated. PayPal launched in 1998, allowing people to send money via email. It was designed initially for online auctions, particularly eBay, but it pointed toward a future where money could flow as easily as any other kind of data over the internet. Online banking became common. People stopped writing checks and visiting bank branches. They just moved money around with clicks and taps. The idea of physically going to a bank to deposit your paycheck started to seem quaint. In many countries, particularly in Europe, electronic payments overtook cash even faster. Scandinavian countries became nearly cashless. In Sweden, many businesses stopped accepting cash altogether. The Swedish central bank estimated that cash transactions made up less than 1% of the value of all payments in the country. Developing countries experienced an even more dramatic transformation. In Kenya, a mobile money system called M-Pesa launched in 2007, allowing people to store money on their phones and transfer it via text message. Within a few years, the majority of Kenyan adults were using it. M-Pesa gave millions of people access to financial services for the first time, leapfrogging the traditional banking system. China experienced perhaps the most dramatic shift. By the 2010s, mobile payment systems like Alipay and WeChat Pay had become ubiquitous. Street vendors accepted QR code payments. Beggars held up QR codes for donations. China went from a predominantly cash economy to a predominantly mobile payment economy in less than a decade. All of this raised new questions. If money was just data, who controlled it? Banks, obviously, but they were subject to government regulation. Governments could monitor electronic transactions in ways they never could with cash. Every swipe of a card, every online purchase created a data trail. Privacy advocates worried about surveillance. If the government could track every transaction, did we still have economic privacy? Some people started talking about the war on cash, arguing that governments and banks wanted to eliminate physical currency to gain more control. But electronic money also had enormous benefits. It was more convenient, more efficient, harder to steal in some ways, easier to track for accounting purposes. Small transactions that weren't practical with cash became feasible. You could charge 99 cents for a digital song, something that would have been impossible with physical currency. The rise of electronic money also enabled new economic arrangements. Subscription services became ubiquitous because automatic recurring charges were easy. The gig economy emerged partly because platforms could handle thousands of small payments efficiently. An Uber driver could give dozens of rides without ever handling cash. Traditional banks started to face competition from tech companies, Apple Pay, Google Pay, Venmo, Cash App. These weren't banks in the traditional sense, but they were performing many of the same functions. They were storing value and facilitating transactions. Financial technology, or fintech, became one of the hottest sectors in the economy. Startups promised to disrupt banking to make financial services faster, cheaper, more accessible. Some succeeded, many didn't. But the direction was clear. Finance was becoming technology, and technology was becoming finance. By 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated trends that were already underway. People avoided touching cash for health reasons. Businesses went online. Governments sent stimulus payments electronically. The pandemic might have been the final push that made electronic money the dominant form of money for most people in developed countries. Physical cash wasn't dead exactly. It still circulated, especially among unbanked populations and for transactions people wanted to keep private, but it was becoming a smaller and smaller percentage of the total money supply. Money had become abstract, weightless, invisible. It was numbers on a screen, moving at the speed of light through fiber optic cables. On October 31st, 2008, at the height of the global financial crisis, someone using the name Satoshi Nakamoto published a 9-page paper online. The title was Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. The paper described a radical idea. What if you could create a currency that didn't require banks, didn't require governments, didn't require any central authority at all? What if money could exist as a decentralized network maintained by anyone who wanted to participate? Satoshi, whoever they really were, had solved a problem that had stumped computer scientists for years: the double spending problem. With digital files, you can copy them infinitely. So how do you create digital money that can't be copied and spent twice? Satoshi's solution was the blockchain, an ingenious system where every transaction is recorded in a public ledger, and the ledger is maintained by a distributed network of computers. In January 2009, Satoshi mined the first Bitcoin block, embedding a message referencing a newspaper headline about bank bailouts. It was a not-so-subtle statement about Bitcoin's purpose: to create money outside the control of governments and banks that had just failed so spectacularly. At first, Bitcoin was a curiosity, a toy for cryptographers and programmers. The first real-world Bitcoin transaction was in 2010 when a programmer paid 10,000 Bitcoins for 2 pizzas. At current prices, those would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a very expensive pizza. But Bitcoin slowly gained traction. Libertarians and anarchists were attracted to the idea of government-independent money. Tech enthusiasts loved the elegant mathematics underlying the system. And yes, criminals found it useful for illegal transactions, particularly on the dark web marketplace Silk Road. By 2013, Bitcoin started getting serious attention from mainstream media and investors. The price was volatile, incredibly so, swinging wildly up and down. People who got in early and held on became millionaires. Others lost everything. More importantly, Bitcoin spawned a revolution. Developers created thousands of alternative cryptocurrencies, or altcoins. Ethereum, launched in 2015, added programmable smart contracts to the blockchain. Litecoin, Ripple, Cardano, Dogecoin, the list went on and on. Each promised some advantage, some improvement on Bitcoin's model. Initial coin offerings, or ICOs, became a new way to fundraise, basically selling cryptocurrency tokens instead of stocks. Some were legitimate projects, many were scams. The crypto space attracted both genuine innovators and shameless grifters, often in equal measure. By 2017, cryptocurrency was in a full-blown bubble, and burst it did, at least temporarily. Bitcoin crashed back below $4,000 in 2018. Many altcoins lost 90% or more of their value. The ICO market dried up. Skeptics declared the whole thing a failed experiment. But cryptocurrency didn't die. Instead, the market consolidated somewhat. Bitcoin remained dominant, and a handful of other cryptocurrencies survived and even thrived. Institutional investors started taking crypto seriously, with major financial firms offering crypto services to clients. The debate about cryptocurrency's actual utility continued. Critics pointed out that it was slow, energy-intensive, and primarily used for speculation rather than as actual currency. Bitcoin could process about 7 transactions per second, while Visa could handle thousands. Bitcoin mining consumed as much electricity as entire countries. Supporters argued that cryptocurrency represented the future of money, that it was still early days, that the technology would improve. They pointed to crypto's use in countries with unstable currencies, where people were using Bitcoin to preserve their wealth. They highlighted how cryptocurrency enabled people to send money across borders without expensive wire transfer fees. One thing became clear: blockchain technology, separate from cryptocurrency, had real potential applications. Companies started exploring using blockchain for supply chain tracking, medical records, voting systems, digital identity. Whether these applications would actually prove better than traditional databases remained to be seen, but there was genuine interest. In 2021, cryptocurrency went mainstream in a new way. Non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, exploded in popularity. People paid millions of dollars for digital art, for video clips, for tweets. It seemed insane to many observers. Why would you pay for something that anyone could copy? NFT enthusiasts argued that ownership was the point, that the blockchain verified you held the original even if copies existed. Critics saw it as the greater fool theory in action, buying worthless digital tokens in hopes of selling them to someone even more foolish. Central banks watched all of this with a mixture of interest and alarm. Some started exploring central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. These would be digital versions of national currencies, issued and controlled by central banks, but using some of the technology developed for cryptocurrency. China led the way with its digital yuan. By the 2020s, the question wasn't whether digital currency would exist, but what form it would take. Would it be decentralized cryptocurrencies? Would it be government-issued CBDCs? Would it be corporate digital currencies issued by tech giants? The 2008 financial crisis changed how we think about money in fundamental ways. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008, it triggered a panic unlike anything since the Great Depression. Banks stopped lending to each other. Credit markets froze. The entire global financial system came within hours of complete collapse. Central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England, had to respond. But they'd already cut interest rates to near zero, using up their traditional tool for stimulating the economy. They needed to do something else, so they invented, or rather reinvented and expanded, something called quantitative easing. The central bank would create money electronically, out of nothing, and use it to buy government bonds and other assets from banks and financial institutions. This would inject money into the financial system and hopefully restart lending. It was an extraordinary step. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which had been under $1 trillion before the crisis, ballooned to over $4 trillion. The Fed was creating trillions of dollars with literally a few keystrokes, a few entries in a database. Critics warned of hyperinflation. If you just print money, they argued, you devalue the currency. Too much money chasing too few goods, prices would skyrocket. We'd end up like Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe. But the hyperinflation never came. There was inflation eventually years later, but nothing catastrophic. Why? Economists debated this intensely. Part of the answer was that the newly created money mostly stayed in the financial system rather than flowing into the real economy. Banks held it as reserves rather than lending it out aggressively. This experience emboldened some economists to propose more radical ideas. Modern monetary theory, or MMT, suggested that countries which issue their own currency can never run out of money. They can always print more. The real constraint isn't financial, it's real resources. As long as there are unemployed workers and idle factories, the government can spend money to put them to work without causing inflation. MMT proponents argued that governments had been too afraid of deficits and debt. They should be spending much more on infrastructure, education, healthcare, green energy. Don't worry about how to pay for it. The government can always create more money. Mainstream economists pushed back hard. MMT wasn't really new, they said, just old ideas dressed up with new rhetoric. And it was dangerous. Yes, governments could create money, but that didn't mean they should. Unconstrained money creation would lead to inflation and destroy the currency's credibility. The debate became politically charged. Progressive politicians in the United States like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez embraced MMT ideas to justify proposals like the Green New Deal. Conservative economists warned of fiscal catastrophe. Then came COVID-19, and suddenly governments around the world were doing exactly what MMT suggested, whether they admitted it or not. They spent trillions on pandemic relief. They sent checks directly to citizens. They funded payroll support programs. Central banks bought government bonds on an unprecedented scale. The US government spent roughly $5 trillion on COVID relief. The Federal Reserve created about $4 trillion in new money. Other countries did similar things proportionally. It was the largest peacetime fiscal and monetary intervention in history. And again, despite dire warnings, hyperinflation didn't immediately materialize. There was significant inflation eventually, reaching levels not seen since the 1980s by 2021 and 2022. But whether this was due to money creation, supply chain disruptions, or other factors remained hotly debated. The pandemic response proved something important. In a crisis, governments had far more capacity to create and spend money than conventional wisdom suggested. The constraints were political, not technical. A government with its own currency could, in fact, just create money to solve problems. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant we weren't as limited by fiscal constraints as we thought. Terrifying because it raised the question, if governments can create money at will, what prevents them from doing so irresponsibly? The answer, as it always has been with fiat currency, is trust and credibility. A currency has value because people trust that it will continue to have value because they trust that the issuing government will act responsibly. Lose that trust and the currency collapses. We've seen this happen in various countries. Venezuela printed money to cover government spending, and the bolivar became worthless. Turkey's lira collapsed when investors lost faith in the government's economic management. Zimbabwe's dollar famously experienced hyperinflation so severe that they eventually abandoned it entirely. But reserve currencies like the dollar, euro, and yen have maintained value despite massive money creation because they're backed by strong, stable economies and governments that, for all their flaws, are generally seen as responsible managers of their currencies. The modern monetary system is built on a kind of collective belief. We all agree that these pieces of paper or these digital numbers have value. And as long as we all keep believing that, it works. It's a beautiful and fragile thing. Money isn't just an economic tool, it's deeply psychological, wound up with our emotions, our sense of self-worth, our relationships, our dreams and fears. Understanding the history of money means understanding how humans think about value and exchange. Think about how you feel when you find a $20 bill in an old jacket. There's a little surge of happiness, right? Even though you're not actually richer, you just forgot you had it. Or think about how it feels to get paid, that moment when your paycheck deposits. There's satisfaction, validation even though it's just numbers appearing in your account. We have weird psychological relationships with money that often defy rational economic behavior. Economists have discovered this through decades of research in behavioral economics, a field that emerged when people started questioning the traditional assumption that humans are rational economic actors. We're not rational about money, we're really not. For example, there's the concept of mental accounting. We treat money differently depending on where it comes from or what we've designated it for. You might be reluctant to spend $100 from your savings account on a nice dinner, but you'll happily spend a $100 tax refund on the same dinner. Rationally, it's the same money. Psychologically, it feels different. There's the endowment effect. We value things more highly once we own them. If someone gives you a coffee mug, you'll probably demand more money to sell it than you would have paid to buy it in the first place. The mug didn't change. Your perception of its value changed because of ownership. We're loss averse. Losing $100 feels worse than gaining $100 feels good. This isn't rational, but it's deeply human. We'll take bigger risks to avoid losses than we will to achieve equivalent gains. This drives all sorts of economic behavior, from stock market decisions to gambling. Money is also deeply social. We compare ourselves to others constantly. Your salary doesn't just represent purchasing power, it represents status, success, your place in the social hierarchy. This is why people care so much about raises, even when they don't particularly need more money. It's about recognition. Throughout history, conspicuous consumption has been a way to display wealth and status. In some cultures, you'd wear gold jewelry. In modern America, you might drive a luxury car or live in a big house. These aren't purely functional choices, they're signals. Anthropologists studying gift economies found something interesting. In many traditional societies, the most generous people, those who gave away the most, had the highest status. It wasn't about accumulating wealth, it was about demonstrating wealth by giving it away. The potlatch ceremonies of Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples took this to an extreme, with chiefs competing to give away or even destroy valuable goods. We see echoes of this in modern philanthropy. Billionaires don't just donate money, they make sure everyone knows they've donated. It's not cynical to point this out. The social recognition is part of what motivates the giving, and that's okay. Humans are social creatures. We care what others think. Money also has moral dimensions that vary across cultures and time periods. Many religions have grappled with money's role in spiritual life. Christianity traditionally viewed excessive wealth with suspicion. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. The early Christian church practiced communal ownership of goods. Islam prohibits charging interest on loans, viewing it as exploitative. Islamic banking has developed sophisticated alternatives to interest-bearing loans that technically comply with religious law while still allowing for profit. Buddhism teaches non-attachment to material possessions, though Buddhist societies have varied enormously in how seriously they take this in practice. The Protestant work ethic, as described by sociologist Max Weber, created a different relationship with money. Wealth became a sign of God's favor, of virtue. Accumulating money through hard work and thrift was moral. This mindset arguably helped fuel the rise of capitalism in Protestant countries. Different cultures also have different attitudes toward debt. In some societies, being in debt carries shame. In others, particularly modern America, it's normalized. The average American household carries thousands of dollars in credit card debt, plus student loans, car loans, mortgages. We've accepted debt as a normal part of life. Money affects our relationships in complex ways. Financial stress is one of the leading causes of divorce. Arguments about money can destroy friendships. Lending money to friends or family is fraught with peril. Mix money and personal relationships and things get messy. There's also the phenomenon of lifestyle inflation. As people earn more, they tend to spend more, upgrading their lifestyle to match their income. The happiest relationship with money, research suggests, is having enough. Not infinite wealth, but enough to cover needs, some wants, and feel secure. Beyond that point, more money doesn't correlate strongly with more happiness. Money is power. That's not a metaphor. Control over money is control over resources, over people's livelihoods, over political systems. Throughout history, those who controlled the money supply controlled society. In medieval times, kings regularly debased the currency, reducing the precious metal content of coins to fund their wars and luxuries. They could do this because they had the power to declare what was and wasn't legal tender. Citizens had little recourse. The establishment of central banks changed this dynamic, but not as much as you might think. Central banks were supposed to be independent, insulated from political pressure. In reality, they've always existed in a complex relationship with government, sometimes resisting political pressure, sometimes accommodating it. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it's making a decision that affects millions of people's lives. It makes borrowing more expensive, which slows economic growth, which reduces employment. These aren't just technical economic adjustments. They're decisions about winners and losers, who sits on central bank boards. Traditionally, former bankers, finance executives, academic economists, people from similar educational and class backgrounds. These are the people making decisions about monetary policy that affect everyone from the unemployed worker to the billionaire investor. Critics have long argued that this is fundamentally undemocratic. The Federal Reserve wields enormous power, but its officials aren't elected, they're appointed. The democratic accountability is indirect at best. This is by design, the argument being that monetary policy should be insulated from political pressure and short-term thinking. But it raises questions. Why should a small group of unelected experts have so much power? Who do they really serve? The International Monetary Fund presents similar questions on a global scale. When countries face financial crises, they often turn to the IMF for bailout loans, but these loans come with conditions. The country must implement specific economic policies, usually involving cutting government spending, privatizing state assets, and opening markets to foreign investment. Critics call this economic imperialism. Rich countries, through their control of international financial institutions, impose their preferred policies on poor countries. The IMF disputes this, arguing they're just implementing sound economic policies that will help countries develop. The debate over debt relief for poor countries highlights these power dynamics. Many African and Latin American countries carry debts they have no realistic hope of repaying. These debts were often incurred by corrupt dictators and went to fund vanity projects or were simply stolen. Should the current population be burdened with these debts? Creditor countries and banks generally say yes. A debt is a debt. It must be repaid. Forgiveness would create moral hazard, encouraging future irresponsibility. But activists argue this is fundamentally unjust. The people carrying the debt burden didn't benefit from the loans. They're being punished for corruption they had no part in. Within countries, control over credit is a major source of inequality. Banks decide who gets loans and at what interest rates. Historically, this has meant that poor people and minorities often couldn't get credit or could only get it at exploitative rates. This restricts economic opportunity and perpetuates poverty. Redlining in the United States, where banks literally drew red lines on maps around predominantly black neighborhoods and refused to lend there, was official policy for decades. It meant black families couldn't get mortgages to buy homes, couldn't build wealth through property ownership. The effects of these policies still reverberate today. Modern financial technology promises to democratize access to credit through algorithms that assess risk more fairly. But algorithms can perpetuate bias if they're trained on biased historical data, and they lack human judgment that might consider extenuating circumstances. The credit score system in the United States wields enormous power over people's lives. A low credit score can prevent you from renting an apartment, getting a job, or buying a car. It can mean you pay higher insurance premiums and interest rates, which makes you poorer, which makes it harder to improve your score. It's a vicious cycle. Political campaigns cost money, lots of it. In the United States, running for major office requires raising millions or even billions of dollars. This gives enormous influence to wealthy donors and industries. Politicians may not be explicitly bribed, but they're certainly influenced by who funds their campaigns. The phrase money in politics usually refers to campaign contributions, but it's broader than that. Lobbying is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Corporations and interest groups hire lobbyists to influence legislation. They fund think tanks to produce favorable research. They run advertising campaigns to shape public opinion. This isn't necessarily corruption in the illegal sense, it's how the system works. But it raises questions about whether democracy can truly function when some voices are so much louder than others because they have more money to amplify them. The concentration of wealth itself is a form of power. When a handful of individuals control more wealth than half the world's population combined, They have extraordinary ability to shape society. They fund political movements, they own media companies, they make investment decisions that affect millions of jobs. Some use this power responsibly, attempting to address social problems through philanthropy. Others use it primarily to accumulate more wealth and power. But either way, it's power that comes from money, not from democratic. As money becomes increasingly digital, we face a new challenge: the digital divide. About a quarter of American adults don't have a bank account or rely on alternative financial services like check-cashing stores and payday lenders. Globally, about 1.4 billion adults don't have access to formal financial services at all. Being unbanked in a digital economy is expensive and limiting. Without a bank account, you can't easily cash checks without paying fees. You can't build credit history. You can't access many digital services. You often end up paying more for everything. Payday lenders charge effective annual interest rates that can exceed 400%. Check cashing stores take a percentage of every check. If you don't have a bank account, you're essentially paying a poverty tax, charged more for basic financial services because you have less money. Why don't people have bank accounts? Sometimes it's because they don't have the required identification or proof of address. Sometimes they've had accounts closed in the past due to overdraft fees, and now can't open new ones. Sometimes banks simply don't want to serve low-income customers because the accounts aren't profitable enough. Many unbanked people also don't trust banks, and given the history of banks discriminating against poor and minority communities, this distrust isn't irrational. The shift toward digital payment systems can make this worse. If businesses stop accepting cash, people without bank accounts or smartphones are excluded. They literally can't participate in parts of the economy. Some cities have started passing laws requiring businesses to accept cash for this reason. It's recognizing that cashless isn't just a convenience issue, it's an equity issue. In developing countries, the challenges are different but related. Traditional banking infrastructure is expensive to build. You need branches, ATMs, staff. In rural or poor areas, banks often don't bother because there's no profit in it. But mobile phones have changed the equation. Even in very poor areas, many people have basic cell phones. Mobile money systems like M-Pesa have provided millions of people with financial services for the first time. You don't need a bank account, you just need a phone. This has been transformative. Small business owners can accept payments easily. People can save money safely instead of hiding cash at home. Families can receive remittances from relatives working in cities without expensive wire transfer fees. India has taken this further with its Jan Dhan program, which aimed to give every household a bank account. They've opened hundreds of millions of accounts, many linked to biometric identification. The goal is to bring everyone into the formal financial system. Critics worry about privacy and government surveillance. If every transaction is digital and tied to your biometric ID, the government can track everything you do economically. That's a lot of power to give authorities, but supporters argue the benefits outweigh the risks. Financial inclusion helps reduce poverty. It allows people to access credit to start businesses. It makes it easier to receive government benefits. It reduces corruption because there's less opportunity for money to disappear. Cryptocurrency advocates see digital currencies as a solution to financial inclusion. Bitcoin doesn't require a bank account or government approval. If you have a smartphone and internet access, you can use it. In theory, it could bank the unbanked. In practice, cryptocurrency hasn't proven particularly useful for financial inclusion yet. It's too volatile to use for everyday transactions. Transaction fees can be high. It requires a level of technical sophistication that many people don't have. And if you lose your private key, your money is gone forever with no recourse. Still, the underlying idea is appealing. Financial services that aren't controlled by traditional institutions, that don't require permission, that are accessible to anyone. Microfinance was supposed to solve financial inclusion too. Muhammad Yunus won a Nobel Prize for pioneering microcredit, small loans to poor people, especially women, in Bangladesh. The model spread worldwide, But microfinance has had mixed results. Some people have used microloans to start successful businesses and lift themselves out of poverty. Others have gotten trapped in debt. The reality is complex and varies by region and implementation. There's no single solution to financial inclusion. It requires multiple approaches: regulatory reforms to make banking accessible, technology to reduce costs, financial literacy education, consumer protections to prevent exploitation, and a recognition that access to financial services is increasingly essential in modern society. As money becomes more digital, ensuring that everyone can participate in the digital economy becomes a matter of basic fairness. If we're going to live in a cashless society, we need to make sure no one is left behind in the transition. The way we handle this challenge will shape what kind of society we become. Will we create a more inclusive financial system that serves everyone? Or will we deepen divides between those who have access to digital financial services and those who do not? Where is money heading? We're living through a period of rapid transformation, and it's not entirely clear what the monetary system will look like in 20 or 50 years. Central bank digital currencies are almost certainly coming. China is already testing its digital yuan in multiple cities. The European Central Bank is exploring a digital euro. The Fed is researching a digital dollar, though they're moving cautiously. CBDCs would be like cash in that they'd be direct liabilities of the central bank, but digital. You might have an account directly with the Federal Reserve instead of with a commercial bank, or it might work through banks but with different technical infrastructure. This raises fascinating questions. If people can bank directly with the central bank, what happens to commercial banks? Their main function has been safeguarding deposits and facilitating payments. If the central bank does that, what role do private banks play? Central banks are thinking carefully about this. They don't want to disintermediate the banking system. So CBDCs might be designed to work through banks, or they might limit how much CBDC each person can hold. Privacy is another huge issue. Cash is anonymous. Digital currency, at least as governments are likely to implement it, is not. Every transaction could be tracked. This enables better tax collection and makes certain crimes harder to commit, but it also enables surveillance on a scale never before possible. China's digital yuan is explicitly designed to be traceable by the government. The Chinese government doesn't see this as a problem, they see it as a feature. Western democracies claim they'll build in more privacy protections, but it remains to be seen how much privacy they'll actually allow. Then there's the question of programmable money. With digital currency, you could attach rules to money itself. You could create money that expires if not spent by a certain date, encouraging immediate spending. You could create money that can only be used for specific purchases like food or housing. You could automatically collect taxes every time money changes hands. This is either exciting or terrifying depending on your perspective. It could make policy more efficient and responsive, or it could give governments and corporations unprecedented control over how we use money. Decentralized finance, or DeFi, offers a different vision. Using blockchain and smart contracts, you could create a financial system without banks or intermediaries. Lending, borrowing, trading, insurance, all happening automatically through code. The DeFi space has seen explosive growth with billions of dollars locked in various protocols, but it's also seen spectacular failures, hacks, and scams. The technology is promising but immature, and it's not clear whether it will become mainstream or remain a niche. Some people imagine a future where we don't have unified national currencies at all. Instead, we might have multiple competing private currencies, including corporate digital currencies. Facebook tried to launch one called Libra, though it failed due to regulatory pushback. But the idea hasn't died. In this scenario, you might use Apple Coin for some transactions, Amazon Bucks for others, Bitcoin for others still. Currency exchange would happen automatically in the background. You'd choose currencies based on which offered the best features or rewards. This would be a return to the historical norm in some ways. For most of history, multiple currencies circulated simultaneously. The idea of one unified national currency is relatively recent and might prove to be temporary. Universal basic income is another idea gaining traction that would change our relationship with the money. If governments gave everyone a regular unconditional payment, it would alter the meaning of money in fundamental ways. Money wouldn't just be something you earned through labor, it would be a right, something you received as a member of society. Automation and artificial intelligence make UBI seem more plausible or perhaps necessary. If machines do most of the work, what do humans do? How do people earn money? UBI could be an answer. Critics worry about inflation, cost, and work incentives. Supporters point to pilot programs showing positive results. It's one of the major economic debates of our time, and it's fundamentally about what money is for and how it should be distributed. Climate change will impact money too. Some economists propose carbon currencies where emissions are capped and tradable. Others suggest currencies designed to incentivize sustainable behavior, depreciating if used for environmentally harmful purchases. The European Union is implementing carbon border taxes, tariffs based on the carbon content of imported goods. This makes carbon into a kind of hidden cost built into money, a price adjustment to account for environmental damage. We might see money itself become multidimensional, with carbon credits or social impact scores attached to transactions. Money wouldn't just represent economic value, but environmental and social value too. One thing seems certain: money will continue to evolve. It always has. From cowrie shells to cryptocurrency, from clay tablets recording debts to blockchain ledgers, humans have constantly reinvented money to meet changing needs. The money of the future will be shaped by technology, but also by our values, our politics, our vision for what kind of society we want to create. Does money buy happiness? It's one of the oldest questions, and the answer turns out to be sort of sometimes up to a point. Research consistently shows that money does correlate with happiness, but the relationship isn't linear. Going from poverty to having enough to meet your basic needs makes a huge difference in happiness. Going from middle class to wealthy makes much less difference. And going from wealthy to super wealthy barely matters at all. There's what psychologists call the hedonic treadmill. When something good happens, like getting a raise or buying a new car, we feel happier temporarily, but we adapt quickly to our new circumstances and return to our baseline level of happiness. Then we need another boost, another purchase, another achievement. This is why people who win the lottery often report being no happier a year later than they were before winning. The initial euphoria fades, they adapt to their new wealth, and they're back to their previous level of happiness, or even lower, due to the stress and complications that sudden wealth brings. A famous study suggested that happiness plateaus around $75,000 a year in income. Beyond that, more money doesn't increase day-to-day happiness much. Though recent research has challenged this, finding that happiness continues to increase with income, just at a slower rate. What seems clear is that money primarily buys happiness by solving problems and reducing stress. If you're worried about paying rent or affording healthcare, money can buy tremendous relief. If you're already comfortable, more money helps much less. Money also buys time, and time is one of the things that actually does correlate strongly with happiness. If you can afford to hire someone to clean your house or do chores you dislike, you free up time for activities you enjoy. That's money well spent for happiness. Experiences tend to make people happier than possessions. A vacation creates memories that can be enjoyed for years. A new gadget provides a brief thrill and then becomes just another object. This is why spending money on travel, concerts, or dinner with friends often generates more happiness per dollar than buying stuff. Interestingly, spending money on others tends to make people happier than spending on themselves. Buying a gift, treating a friend to dinner, donating to charity, these create positive emotions that last longer than self-indulgent purchases. We're social creatures, and acts of generosity tap into something deep in human psychology. Money can also damage happiness, particularly when it becomes an obsession. People who are highly motivated by money tend to be less happy than those motivated by other things like relationships, personal growth, or helping others. When you're constantly comparing yourself to richer people, You can never have enough money to be satisfied. The relationship between money and happiness is also cultural. In individualistic societies like the United States, personal wealth matters more to happiness. In collectivist societies, family and community relationships matter more, and individual wealth less. There's also a difference between having money and pursuing money. Having enough money to live comfortably correlates with happiness. Constantly chasing more money, working excessive hours, sacrificing relationships and health for career advancement, these often decrease happiness even as they increase wealth. The wealthy often report feeling time poor. Ironically, having more money can mean feeling like you have less time, because you're busier managing your wealth, maintaining your lifestyle, and meeting social obligations that come with affluence. Financial security seems to matter more to happiness than the absolute amount of money. Knowing you can handle an unexpected expense, that you have savings, that you won't lose your home if you lose your job, this provides psychological comfort that wealth alone doesn't necessarily provide. Debt has a particularly negative impact on happiness, even controlling for income. The psychological burden of owing money, of payments looming over you, significantly reduces well-being. This is one reason why financial advisors often recommend paying off debt before investing, even though investing might make more mathematical sense. Money also affects relationships in complex ways. Financial stress is hard on marriages and families, but money can't buy happy relationships. Some of the most dysfunctional families are wealthy, with money creating conflicts and suspicion rather than harmony. Children from wealthy families face their own challenges. They may struggle with questions of identity and purpose, wondering if they're valued for themselves or their family's wealth. They may feel pressure to maintain a lifestyle or live up to expectations. Some develop what's called affluenza, a disconnection from the value of work and money. The happiest approach to money seems to be having enough to feel secure and meet your needs, but not obsessing over accumulating more. Using money as a tool to build a good life, not as an end in itself or a measure of self-worth. Money is important, it's necessary, it enables us to do things we value. But it's a mistake to think that money equals success or that wealth equals happiness. Some of the happiest people have modest means. Some of the wealthiest people are miserable. What matters most is how you use money and how you think about it. If we've learned anything from thousands of years of monetary history, it's that money is powerful but also fragile. Its value rests on trust, and trust can evaporate quickly. Every hyperinflation, every currency collapse, every financial crisis has shaken that trust. And yet somehow monetary systems rebuild. People create new currencies or restore faith in old ones. The human need to exchange value is so fundamental that we always find a way. One lesson is that there's no perfect monetary system. The gold standard provided stability but created rigidity. Fiat currency allows flexibility but risks inflation. Every system has trade-offs, and those trade-offs shift as circumstances change. Beware of anyone claiming they have the one true solution to monetary policy. They're probably selling something literally or figuratively. The economy is complex, and simple ideological answers rarely work in practice. History also teaches us that money and power are inseparable. Whoever controls the money supply has enormous influence over society. This is why central bank independence is important, but also why it's always contested. Too much independence and you have unaccountable power. Too little and you have politicians manipulating currency for short-term gain. Financial innovation is constant, but it's not always progress. Many financial products that seemed innovative turned out to be ways to hide risk or extract value from less sophisticated participants. The mortgage-backed securities that caused the 2008 crisis were financial innovation. So was cryptocurrency fraud that bilked people out of billions. We should be cautiously skeptical of financial innovation. Some of it is genuinely useful. Much of it is complexity that primarily benefits financial professionals while adding risk to the system. Bubbles are a recurring feature of financial history. From tulip mania in 17th century Holland to the dot-com bubble to the housing bubble to crypto bubbles, humans repeatedly get caught up in speculative frenzies. We think this time is different, and it never is. The warning signs are usually clear in retrospect. Rapid price increases disconnected from fundamentals, widespread belief that prices will only go up, people taking on debt to speculate, media hype, dismissal of skeptics as outdates or jealous. When you see these signs, be cautious. Financial crises are also recurring. About once per generation, major economies experience serious financial upheaval. This is partly because people forget the lessons of the last crisis and repeat the same mistakes, and partly because the economy is genuinely complex and prone to instability. After every crisis, we reform the financial system, but we can never eliminate risk entirely. We can reduce it, we can manage it better, but capitalism is inherently unstable. The business cycle isn't a bug, it's a feature. Inequality tends to increase during periods of financialization, when the financial sector grows relative to the productive economy. Those closest to money creation, financial professionals and asset owners, benefit disproportionately. Those whose wealth is primarily in their labor suffer. This creates political instability eventually. Extreme inequality has preceded many historical upheavals. Societies can only sustain so much disparity before something breaks. The relationship between money and the real economy matters. Money should facilitate production and exchange, not become an end in itself. When too much economic activity is just money chasing money, speculation rather than production, that's a warning sign. History also shows that monetary systems must evolve. What worked for a small agricultural society doesn't work for a global industrial economy. What worked in the 20th century may not work in the 21st. We need to be willing to adapt our monetary institutions to changing circumstances, but evolution should be careful. Revolutionary changes to monetary systems are risky. The Bretton Woods system emerged from a global war. The end of the gold standard created decades of instability before central banks figured out how to manage fiat currency. Major changes should be approached thoughtfully. Technology changes money but doesn't change human nature. Whether we're trading cowrie shells or Bitcoin, the same emotions drive us: greed, fear, envy, pride, generosity, desperation. Financial technology doesn't make us rational. It just changes the form our irrationality takes. One of the most important lessons is that money is a social construction. It exists because we collectively agree it exists. It has value because we all trust that it has value. This makes it both incredibly robust because social agreements can persist for centuries, and incredibly fragile because if trust collapses, the money becomes worthless instantly. This is why confidence is everything in monetary systems. Central banks spend enormous effort managing expectations, signaling credibility, building trust. A central bank's most important asset isn't gold reserves or foreign currency, it's reputation. Finally, history teaches us that moral and practical questions about money are always with us. How should wealth be distributed? Who should control the money supply? Is debt immoral or useful? What do we owe each other economically? These questions have no final answers. Every generation must answer them again for their own circumstances, navigating between competing values. We've traveled a long way together, from the first cowrie shells passed between hands thousands of years ago, through the mighty coinages of Rome, through medieval banking houses, through the rise and fall of the gold standard, through the digital revolution, all the way to cryptocurrency and whatever comes next. And what have we learned? That money is stranger than we thought, more interesting, more complicated, more human. Money isn't a thing. It never has been. It's a relationship, an agreement, a shared story we tell about value. The paper in your wallet has no intrinsic worth. The numbers in your bank account are just data. They matter only because we all agree they matter. This realization can be unsettling. We want money to be solid, real, backed by something concrete. But it's backed by trust, by social agreement, by the full faith and credit of institutions, and ultimately of each other. And that's okay. Maybe it's even beautiful. Money works because we cooperate, because we honor our agreements, because we trust strangers enough to accept their payment. In a way, every economic transaction is an act of faith in humanity. The history of money is really the history of human civilization. It tracks our progress from small tribes to global society. It reflects our values, our conflicts, our creativity, our capacity for both cooperation and exploitation. We created money to solve practical problems. How do you trade with strangers? How do you save value over time? How do you measure debt and obligation? But money became more than a tool. It shaped us as much as we shaped it. Money enabled the rise of cities because you could buy food rather than growing it yourself. It enabled specialization because you could be a blacksmith or a baker and trade your goods for everything else you needed. It enabled large-scale cooperation between people who didn't know each other personally. But money also enabled inequality, exploitation, and conflict on scales previously impossible. It created new forms of power and new ways to abuse that power. It turned human relationships into calculations, sometimes making us see each other as means to profit rather than as ends in ourselves. The challenge has always been to use money as a tool while not being ruled by it, to participate in monetary economies while remembering that not everything can or should be bought and sold, to pursue financial security without making money the measure of all things. As we move forward into an uncertain future, we'll continue to reshape money to meet new challenges. Climate change, artificial intelligence, increasing automation, shifting geopolitics, all of these will influence how money works. Maybe we'll develop new forms of currency that explicitly account for environmental costs. Maybe we'll adopt universal basic income to address automation. Maybe we'll see central bank digital currencies become the norm. Maybe cryptocurrency will fulfill its promise of decentralized, permissionless money. Maybe something we can't yet imagine will emerge. What seems certain is that money will continue to evolve, because it always has. And the questions we face about money are really questions about what kind of society we want to build. How should we distribute resources? How much inequality is acceptable? What obligations do we have to each other? How do we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility? How do we manage the tension between private profit and public good? These are ancient questions, and every generation must answer them anew. The answers we choose will determine the shape of the monetary system we build. As you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe think about the money in your pocket or your account. Think about the extraordinary chain of events that led to it existing. The innovations and catastrophes, the emperors and economists, the technologies and philosophies, all culminating in that currency you handle so casually every day. Money is a mirror. It reflects who we are, what we value, how we organize our collective lives. And like any mirror, it shows us both our best qualities and our flaws. The history of money is still being written. We're all part of that story every time we make a purchase or send a payment or save for the future. We're participants in this grand experiment in human cooperation that is the monetary system. And that's where we'll leave our journey through time, here at this strange moment when money is more abstract than ever, existing as pulses of electricity and quantum states, yet more powerful than ever in shaping human destiny. Money has come a long way from those first cowrie shells. It's been a fascinating, complex, often troubling journey, but it's our journey, part of the human story. And now, with all these thoughts swirling gently in your mind, you can rest. The history of money will continue without you for a while. Let it all drift away. Let sleep come. The world of money will be waiting when you wake. Good night.